Hi, I'm Lily Simon, and this is my second part to my 1.3 cardiovascular system assignment. So here we're going to be talking about the heart wall anatomy. And the heart is composed of three layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. So the inner wall of the heart is lined by the endocardium, and the myocardium consists of the heart muscle cells that make up the middle layer and the bulk of the heart wall, and the outer layer of cells is called the epicardium. And the second layer which is membranous layer, which is structured, the pericardium that surrounds and protects the heart, and it allows enough room for the vigorous pumping of the heart, but also keeps the heart in place and reduces the friction the heart and other structures. And here is just an image that shows the different layers. So you've got the endothelial layer, and you've got the endocardium, which is here, and the myocardium, and then the epicardium, which is here. And so the pericardium, so the heart sits in this, which is a fluid-filled cavity, which is also called the pericardial cavity. And the walls and the lining of the pericardial cavity are a special membrane known as pericardium. And so the pericardium is a type of serous membrane that produces serous fluid to lubricate the heart and prevent friction between the ever-beating heart and its surrounding organs. And besides the lubrication, the pericardium serves to hold the heart in position and to maintain a hollow space for the heart to expand in when it is full. So the structure of the heart wall entails having an epicardium. So the epicardium is the outermost layer of the heart wall, and it's just another name for the visceral layer of the pericardium. And the myocardium is the muscular middle layer, which is here, and it contains the cardiac muscle tissue. So the myocardium makes up the majority of the thickness and the mass of the heart wall, and is the part of the heart responsible for the pumping of the blood. And lastly, the endocardium is just an endothelium layer, which is the layer that lies inside the heart. And the endocardium is very smooth and is responsible for keeping the blood from sticking to the inside of the heart and forming potentially blood clots. So now we're going to be moving on to the pericardial sac. So the pericardial sac looks like this, and it's a double-walled sac, and it has the epicardium covers the heart's outer surface, and which is this bit here, which is the visceral pericardium, and the two layers, a serous layer and a fibrous layer. And the pericardial sac is the membrane lining of the pericardial cavity which surrounds the heart. So now we're going to be moving on to the cardiac cycle. So what is the cardiac cycle? So the cardiac cycle refers to the complex heartbeat from its generation to the beginning of the next beat, and so it includes the diastole, the systole, and the intervening pause. The frequency of the cardiac cycle is described by the heart rate, which typically expressed as beats per minute. So the cardiac cycle, we'll be talking about the cardiac cycle, the contraction, and the systole, and the diastole, and the relaxation. So we'll be moving on to here just shows every time your heart beats, which is an average of an adult will be about 72 beats per minute, the diastole and systole will occur. So the diastole means the relaxation phase of the heart, and there is no muscle contraction in the ventricles or in the atria. And during this relaxation stage, it's when the blood fills the chambers. So during the atrial diastole, blood will fill the atria, and during the ventricle diastole, blood will fill the ventricles. So then we have the systole. And so this systole is the contraction phase of the heart chamber. And like before, we can have the atrial systole and the ventricular systole. And this is where the atrials will contract, or when the ventricles will contract. And when the systole occurs in one of the chambers, the blood is pushed up and ejected out of them from the bottom to the top. So then this bit here just shows an overview. So the cardiac cycle is what we measure manually, and we would use a heart rate monitor to measure our heart rate and to find our pulse, which is a number of cycles that will occur in a minute. So an average being about 72 beats per minute for an adult, that would mean about 72 cardiac cycles would happen in that per minute. So then we have the two phases. We have the systole and we have the diastole. And the diastole takes about roughly 0.5 of a second. And well, that takes about 0.5 of a second to happen, whereas the systole takes even quicker than that, which is 0.3 of a second. So it takes 0.3 of a second to contract the atria and the ventricles. So therefore, overall, the whole cardiac cycle process would take roughly 0.8 of a second. And here we're just going to be talking about the conduction system of the heart. So here we have the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, and the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibres. And this represents a specialised cardiac tissue. These fibres are also auto-excitable, as they have the potential to generate the electricity activity without any external stimuli, and this makes the heart beat continuously. So the cardiac conduction system is a group of specialised cardiac muscle cells in the wall of the heart, and that sends the signals to the heart muscle which causes it to contract. So the main components of the cardiac conduction system are the SA node, the AV node, and the bundle of His and the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibres. So the SA node is an anatomical pacemaker, and this starts the sequence by causing the atrial muscles to contract, and then from there the signal travels to the AV node, which is about here, through the bundle of His, and down the bundle branches through to the Purkinje fibres, which is causing the ventricles to contract. This signal creates an electrical current that can be seen on a graph as an electrocardiogram or an EKG or an ECG. So doctors use these to monitor the cardiac conduction system electrical activity in the heart. So here we are going to move on to the cardiac contractions. So a muscle contraction is imitated by an action potential that is normally originated from the pacemaker site, or also known as the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. And action potentials depolarize cells which causes the contraction. So initiated by the action potential that are generated by the sinoatrial node, which is located in the upper posterior wall of the atrium. The depolarization of these cells, or the valves, cause a wave of electrical activity to sweep across the atrium and down the ventricles, and this electrical activity causes the muscle cells themselves to depolarize, which then initiates a contraction. So this sequence of the contraction is that the first tissues undergo a depolarization are found in the right and left atrial muscles, and so these muscles will be the ones to contract first. So now we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle again, but here we're going to be talking about the systole. And systole is the part of the cardiac cycle when the ventricles contract. So when the smaller and the upper atrial chambers contract in the late diastole, they send blood down to the larger and lower ventricle chambers. And the lower chambers are filled and the valves to the atria are closed. So systole represents the time during which the left and right ventricles contract and eject the blood from the aorta and the pulmonary artery. During systole, the aortic and pulmonary valves open to emit an ejection in the aorta and the pulmonary artery. This atrioventricular valves are closed during systole, and therefore no blood is entering the ventricles. However, blood continues to enter the atria through the vena cava and the pulmonary veins. So here we just talk about systole is the heart muscles contracting. Now we're going to be talking about diastole. And diastole is a part of the cardiac cycle when the heart refills with blood, and the ventricular diastole is a period when the ventricles are passively filling with blood, and atrial diastole is when the atria passively fills with blood as well. Here's another diagram to show you, and here just shows the heart muscles will relax. So the diastole represents a period of time when the ventricles are relaxed and not contracting. So throughout this period, blood is passively flowing through the left atrium and the right atrium, into the left ventricle and into the right ventricle. And the blood flows through the atrial ventricular valves, through the mitral and the tricuspid, and that separate the atria from the ventricles. The venous blood from the body through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The LA receives the oxygenated blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, through the four pulmonary veins, and into the LA again. And at the end of diastole, both atria contract, which means that the additional amount of blood goes into the ventricles. Here is another diagram just showing you more of the diastole, which is filling, and the systole, which is pumping the blood. Here we'll be talking about more of the cardiac cycle, but this diagram shows the cardiac cycle again, but assumes that the atrial diastole has already taken place. This is because you can see from the diagram that the blood has already filled the left and right atria. So then the process moves on to the ventricular diastole, which is when the ventricles start to passively fill. It is passive because of the build-up of pressure in the atria. So it has become so high that it forces the atrioventricular valves to open, and the blood starts to go top into the ventricles, and therefore there is no contracting in the heart at this stage. And only about 70% of the blood will go into the ventricles. So this leaves about 30% left in the atria. So to get the rest of this 30% of the blood out of the atria and back into the ventricles, the atrial contraction has to occur. And this is where both of the top left and right chambers both contract and squeeze the rest of the blood down back into the ventricles. So at the end of these two stages of getting the blood to move from the atria into the ventricles is called ventricular diastole or ventricular filling. So now we have the ventricles full of blood, we want to get the blood to travel out of the aorta and out of the pulmonary artery and into the lungs and to the rest of the body, and to not go back into the atrium, so prevent the backflow by these valves snapping shut. So therefore, they're not allowing the blood to go back up into the atria, so the AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, close to prevent backflow. Then we have ventricular systole, when the ventricles contract, the bottom two chambers now contract, which pushes the blood through the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve to the pulmonary artery and the aorta. And the ventricular contraction basically ejects the blood out of ventricles into the two different circulation systems, sorry.